she vanished without a trace in the middle of the night. Her family was desperate, the town was shaken, and the investigators were left with more questions than answers. But when the truth was finally uncovered, no one was ready for what they found. Hey, true crime fans! I'm Eamon, and I'm thrilled to share crime tales across times with you. Each episode will explore a new case, examining the evidence and discussing the twists and turns. My goal is to create a community where we can discuss these cases, share our thoughts, and learn from each other. So, let's get started. Rowan Ford was just 9 years old when she disappeared on November 2nd, 2007. She lived in Stella, Missouri, a small, quiet town where crime was almost unheard of. A bright, kind, and artistic child, Rowan loved Sunday school, playing outside, and drawing. She had a big heart and an innocent, joyful spirit that made her adored by those who knew her. That night, Rowan's mother, Colleen, left for her late-night shift at a local Walmart, as she often did. She entrusted Rowan's care to her stepfather, David Spears, believing she was safe at home. But by morning, Rowan was gone. When Colleen returned home and discovered her daughter missing, she immediately confronted David. His response was unsettling. He casually claimed that Rowan had asked to sleep over at a friend's house, and he had let her go without bothering to ask which friend or confirm with any parents. Colleen, confused and alarmed, started calling Rowan's friends one by one, but none of them had seen her. Rowan never made it to any sleepover. She had simply vanished into the night. As panic set in, Colleen contacted the police, and an intense search began. Authorities and volunteers scoured the small town and its surroundings, hoping for any clue that could lead them to the missing child. With each passing hour, fear and suspicion grew. If Rowan hadn't gone to a friend's house, then where was she? And why was David Spears so indifferent about her disappearance? The case quickly took a dark turn, revealing shocking secrets and a horrifying truth about what really happened to Rowan Ford. As soon as Colleen Ford realized her daughter, Rowan, was missing, she wasted no time in calling the police. Officers arrived at the Ford home in Stella, Missouri, and immediately began their investigation. They questioned Rowan's stepfather, David Spears, who was the last known person to see her. David claimed that Rowan had asked to stay at a friend's house for a sleepover. This seemed highly unusual. What parent would let a 9-year-old leave without knowing where they were going? As hours passed with no sign of Rowan, authorities expanded the search and called in the FBI for assistance. Rowan's disappearance had rocked the small town of Stella, and everyone was desperate for answers. Volunteers gathered to help law enforcement, combing through wooded areas, fields, and creeks in the hopes of finding any clue. FBI agents began conducting door-to-door interviews, asking neighbors and school friends if they had seen Rowan that night or knew where she might have gone. Meanwhile, investigators focused their efforts on David Spears, believing he knew more than he was saying. As investigators pressed David Spears for details, his story began to shift. He initially claimed he had spent the evening drinking with 2 friends, Christopher Collings and Nathan Hetty, at Collings's trailer in Berry County, Missouri, about 7 miles from Stella. According to David, he drank heavily, eventually returned home, checked on Rowan, and then went to bed. Police, however, were not convinced. His behavior seemed off. He was too calm. His story was vague, and key details didn't add up. Something about his demeanor suggested that he wasn't telling the whole truth. Determined to uncover the facts, investigators began looking into David's alibi. While they confirmed that he had indeed been drinking with his friends, they noticed gaps in his timeline. He couldn't fully account for all his movements that night, and detectives began to wonder, had he left his friends for a period before returning home? As officers pressed him further, David became visibly nervous. His statements grew inconsistent. At times, he claimed he had passed out from drinking, while at other times, he said he had checked on Rowan before going to bed. These contradictions raised even more red flags. While suspicions around David Spears continued to grow, investigators turned their attention to Christopher Collings, the man David had been drinking with that night. Collings, a 32-year-old construction worker, had a troubling past marked by violent tendencies. When police questioned Collings, he admitted to drinking with David that night, but appeared uneasy, his answers conflicting. At first, he insisted he had gone home and slept, but later, he hinted that he might have left his trailer during the night. This inconsistency set off alarms for investigators. With no sign of Rowan and both men acting suspiciously, authorities dug deeper into their backgrounds, searching for any connection between them and Rowan's disappearance. Meanwhile, the small town of Stella was gripped with fear and desperation. Volunteers searched through forests, abandoned buildings, and rural roads, hoping to find any trace of the missing girl. Rowan Ford, Rowan's mother, was distraught, pleading with the public for any information. She refused to believe that her little girl had simply vanished without a trace. Law enforcement worked tirelessly, determined to break the stories that David and Christopher were telling. The pressure on both men was mounting, and soon one of them would crack under the weight of the truth. For 6 agonizing days, the town of Stella held its breath, praying that Rowan would be found alive. Colleen spent every moment searching for answers, clinging to the hope that her daughter was still out there. But deep down, a terrible fear had settled in, the kind of fear that grows when the hours stretch into days and the worst possibilities start to feel inevitable. Investigators had been pushing David for answers, but his lies kept unraveling. The real breakthrough came when they turned their full attention to Christopher Collings. At first, Collings denied everything. He maintained that he had been drinking and had gone home afterward, insisting that he had nothing to do with Rowan's disappearance. But detectives weren't convinced. His alibi was weak, his behavior was erratic, and every time he was questioned, his body language betrayed him. He avoided eye contact, his hands trembled, and at times, he broke down in tears. Detectives pushed harder. They showed him pictures of Rowan, her innocent, smiling face staring back at him. They reminded him of the little girl who had vanished. The weight of the investigation bore down on him. Then, after days of silence, he finally spoke. "I did it. I killed her." The room went still. Investigators braced themselves for what they were about to hear. Collings confessed that on the night Rowan disappeared, after drinking heavily with David Spears and Nathan Hetty, he had left his trailer with one purpose. He was going to take Rowan. He drove to the Spears home, walked inside without resistance, and found the little girl fast asleep in her bed. Without hesitation, he lifted her in his arms and carried her out into the night. She barely had time to wake up before he placed her in his truck and drove away. When they arrived at his trailer, the small, filthy space reeked of alcohol and cigarettes. At some point, Rowan woke up, disoriented and afraid. She saw Collings' face and realized she was somewhere unfamiliar. Panic set in. She started crying, pleading for her mother. Collings later claimed he hadn't intended to harm her, that he only wanted to scare her. But as she sobbed and begged to go home, he panicked. She had seen his face. She would know who had taken her. fear and desperation overtook him. He grabbed a rope. Rowan screamed for help, her small voice breaking through the night, but it was no use. Collings wrapped the rope around her tiny neck and pulled. Her little hands clawed at it, trying to break free, but he didn't stop. He pulled tighter and tighter until there was nothing left. The room went silent. Rowan Ford was gone. Collings, now realizing the horror of what he had done, wrapped her lifeless body in a blanket. He drove aimlessly through the night, searching for a place to hide his crime. Eventually, he stopped at an abandoned well in a remote area near Powell, Missouri. Without a second thought, he tossed Rowan's body inside, covering her with leaves and branches before driving away, believing no one would ever find her. 6 days later, following Collings' confession, investigators arrived at the abandoned farm he had described. In the cold morning air, officers peered into the dark, narrow well. When a flashlight was shined down, the truth was undeniable. There, at the bottom, lay Rowan's small, fragile body. The autopsy confirmed the horrifying details. Rowan had been assaulted. She had been strangled with a rope. Her body showed no signs of a struggle. She had been too small to fight back. The details were even worse than anyone had feared. Both Christopher Collings and David Spears were arrested. As the courtroom filled with people seeking justice for 9-year-old Rowan Ford, the air was thick with grief and anger. Colleen Ford, her mother, sat in the front row, her face pale and hollow from exhaustion. Her hands trembled in her lap, clutching a small photograph of her daughter, the same smiling face that had once brought light to her world. Now, that world was shattered. Rowan's case had shaken the entire state of Missouri, and the courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and law enforcement officers who had spent days searching for her. Everyone wanted answers, but more than anything, they wanted justice. Christopher Collings, the man responsible for Rowan's brutal murder, sat across from them, shackled and expressionless. He had confessed in agonizing detail to the abduction, assault, and murder of the little girl, but now he barely lifted his gaze. His once confident demeanor had vanished, replaced by an almost empty stare. David Spears, Rowan's stepfather, was also in custody, charged with second-degree murder for his involvement in the cover-up. His betrayal cut even deeper than the crime itself. He had allowed this to happen. He had let Rowan down. When the prosecution presented the evidence, the courtroom fell into a haunting silence. The jury listened as forensic experts detailed the results of Rowan's autopsy. They spoke about the bruises on her small body, the marks left by the rope that ended her life. The photographs, too gruesome for the public to see, were shown only to the jurors. Some of them turned away, struggling to contain their emotions. Others clenched their fists in anger. But no one was in more pain than Colleen. As the prosecutors described how her little girl had suffered, how she must have cried out for help, how she had died alone in terror, Colleen could no longer hold back her tears. Silent sobs racked her body as she covered her mouth, trying to muffle the sound. The courtroom blurred before her eyes. How could this be real? How could the child she had loved and nurtured, the one who had once held her hand so tightly, be gone in such a horrific way? Colleen had known grief before. She had struggled in life, but nothing could compare to this. The unbearable pain of losing a child to pure evil. She kept replaying that night in her mind, wishing she had done something different, wishing she had stayed home instead of going to work, wishing she had hugged Rowan tighter before leaving, wishing she had somehow stopped the unimaginable. As the trial continued, witnesses were called to testify. Friends and family spoke about Rowan's gentle spirit, her love for drawing, and her kind heart. Teachers recalled her bright smile in the classroom, how she had once drawn a picture of herself and her mother with the words, "Best mommy ever," scribbled underneath. That memory alone was enough to break Colleen all over again. When Christopher Collings took the stand, he admitted his guilt, but his voice was devoid of remorse. He tried to explain his actions, blaming alcohol, blaming fear, but nothing could justify what he had done. His words meant nothing. The damage was irreversible. Rowan was gone. The jury took little time to deliberate. The verdict was unanimous. Christopher Collings was sentenced to death for the kidnapping and murder of Rowan Ford. David Spears was sentenced to life in prison for his role in the crime. A small sense of justice filled the courtroom, but it could never be enough. No sentence, no punishment could ever bring Rowan back. Rowan's funeral was held shortly after the trial ended. Hundreds of people gathered in the small-town church to say goodbye. The town of Stella, once quiet and peaceful, had been forever changed by her loss. Mourners filled the pews, many holding candles in her memory. Flowers surrounded Rowan's small white casket, and her favorite drawings were placed near the altar, pictures of stars, animals, and her family. A minister spoke about the precious life that had been stolen too soon, about the light Rowan had brought to the world. Colleen sat in the front row, barely able to breathe through her grief. As she approached the casket to say her final goodbye, she gently placed Rowan's favorite stuffed animal beside her, whispering, "You should have been safe. You should still be here." There was no greater pain than this, burying her child, knowing she would never see her grow up, never hear her laughter again. The loss was unbearable. As Rowan was laid to rest, the town of Stella wept. A bright, innocent soul had been taken from them, and nothing would ever be the same again. Rowan Ford's story remains one of the most heartbreaking child murders in Missouri's history. A painful reminder that evil can exist even in the most unexpected places. But through the grief, one thing remained: Rowan's memory. She would never be forgotten. And though justice had been served, the hole left in the hearts of those who loved her would never fully heal. This case reminds us that danger can exist where we least expect it. What do you think? Should David Spears have faced a harsher punishment for his negligence? And do you believe justice was truly served? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more shocking true crime stories from around the world. Until next time, stay safe and stay vigilant. This is Crime Tales Across Times, signing off.